It's with Morgan Loew, live from our First Alert desk in the AZ Family newsroom, and we are talking today about water rights. There's a big development in a story that Morgan's been working on for months now. You talked with the state attorney general. We've been talking about federal water rights and access to the Colorado River. We know that the feds have been talking about stepping in if Arizona and neighboring states, along with tribes, cities, farms, cannot come to some sort of consensus on voluntary cuts to the Colorado River. We've been in a drought for decades now, but you've got an update that you're working on. It's our lead story tonight at 6 and 6:30.
Yeah, and this has to do with our groundwater, which is becoming more and more important as we're looking at these impending huge cuts to our Colorado River water allotment. We're going to be relying more and more on groundwater for our cities, not just our agriculture. And there's sort of a weird little, I guess you'd call it a loophole with Arizona's water law that allows most of our state, if you own land, you can pump as much water out of the ground as you physically can. And in most situations, that's not a big deal. But when it comes to these giant corporate farms, and in some cases farms that are owned by other countries, that have these giant farms, they're pumping all this water and sending what they're growing out of the country, that has created a big issue here. And so it's been kind of a standoff, and we have a big development in that story with regard to a Saudi Arabian farm here in Arizona.
So we're going to go ahead and play a story that gives you a little bit more setting the scene of the backstory on this particular farm from Saudi Arabia that Morgan's talking about, and then we'll get to our developments. But let's go ahead and take a look at that backstory for you now.
It's so open and beautiful.
When Lee Harris moved to the Rio Verde foothills northeast of the valley, she thought she had found paradise in the desert.
Natural desert, and it's right next to the Tonto National Forest. It's a lovely place to live. We've got another rainstorm heading our way.
But today, Lee is doing something she never dreamed she would have to, collecting rainwater in order to stay in her home.
What is this water going to be used for?
Flushing toilets. We started using the rainwater to flush our toilets because we knew that that was a big waste of potable water.
In Rio Verde, the water wells are running dry, and it's become more challenging to get affordable water driven into the area by truck.
Are you guys the canary in the coal mine for the state of Arizona?
We are. We might be for the entire Southwest or West.
Arizona is experiencing a mega drought. It's lasted 20 years. And while people in parts of the state are making a conscious effort to conserve water, there are other areas where businesses are using millions of gallons of water to turn dry desert into green fields. This is the Fondamonte alfalfa farm in the Butler Valley, west of Phoenix. The hay grown here will feed dairy cows back in Saudi Arabia. The farm uses a lot of water. How much? We don't know exactly because it's allowed to use as much as it wants to. Some water experts we spoke to say people are making too much of the Saudi Arabian connection here. That the real problem is not that a Saudi company is allowed to do this, it's that any company is allowed to do this.
The problem is the broken system. It's not evil outsiders coming to take advantage of us. What they're doing is they're just highlighting the problems with the system.
Natalie Koch is a professor of geography at Syracuse University. She's studied water use in the Middle East and in Arizona. She says corporate farms, mining operations, and other big businesses are taking advantage of an outdated state water law that allows landowners to pump virtually unlimited amounts of groundwater if they are outside of Maricopa, Pinal, Pima, and Santa Cruz counties.
If you just let anybody pump what they want, then whoever can drill deep wells can do exactly that, and they can pump as much water as they want and undercut everybody else in the area.
There is evidence in parts of western and eastern Arizona that big farms are starting to empty aquifers, which nearby communities rely on for drinking water. That's what's happening in the Butler Valley.
Farmers are taking a hard look at what they're doing right now.
Jeffrey Silvertooth is a soil scientist. He says state leaders and the agriculture community have no choice but to get realistic about how much water farms can pump out of the ground. Right now, agriculture uses 70% of Arizona's clean water.
Can we afford to have agriculture in this state?
We have about a $23-24 billion industry from agriculture as a whole. I say we can't afford not to have agriculture in this state.
This year, the federal government is expected to reduce Arizona's share of Colorado River water, with farmers slated to take a brunt of the cuts. The state is seeing a surge of new well drilling applications.
There needs to be some kind of way of monitoring and regulating who is drawing what from the aquifers.
It's not just an agriculture problem. At some point in the not-so-distant future, cities like Phoenix, Tucson, and their suburbs will be looking for groundwater in places like the Butler Valley.
Problem is, in our community and so many communities, there are a lot of drought deniers.
Back in Rio Verde, they're hoping for more rain and wondering if this is the Arizona of the future for everyone.
We literally are the first ones to walk the plank.
So based on these 40-plus-year-old state law, these rural areas have very little regulation to no regulation when it comes to the water that companies are pumping out of the ground at great capacity.
Yeah, it goes back to the idea that if you own the land, you can use what's under the land. You can use the water. And, with most cases, that's not a big deal. But when you start having these giant farms like that pump so much water out of the ground, the farm might be here, but you're using water that the areas around you, the people that are around you might need. And in the case of this Fondamonte, Arizona farm, there's evidence that the water they're pumping out of the ground, that the people who live around there, some of those wells are now going dry because they're pumping so much water out of the ground.
At such a fast clip. And I know that you said, I remember when Chris Mace was first sworn in and she had her first news conference talking about the changes she was going to make as state attorney general. She mentioned some red flags and going over some of the old contracts from her predecessor and things like that. And she mentioned that water rights was a red flag.
Yeah, so she ran on this idea that the state was going to come in and start doing things about some of these giant contracts. That Saudi Arabian farm is on state-owned land, and so she ran on the idea that she could do something about it. And what I had heard from politicos and people who work in government was it's easy to say that as a campaign slogan. It's harder to do it because these are contracts, these are water rights, these are well permits that have been signed by the state. So she did, as you mentioned in her first speech, say we're taking a hard look at this. She saw some red flags. So what her office has been doing is looking over these leases, looking over these well applications and looking for problems with them. And she told us yesterday, we're airing this tonight, they found some problems, and there's big developments today with that Fondamonte farm.
It has specifically to do with just the volume of water that they're pumping, right?
Yeah, so what happened was this farm already has these wells. They had put in permits and had permits approved for 2 new high-powered deep water wells. We're not sure if they were replacement wells or new wells, but the bottom line is they were going to go 1,200 feet down and pump each one 3,000 gallons of water per minute. To give you an idea of what that means, that an average family of 4 in the Phoenix area uses 17,000 gallons of water per month. That's a lot of water.
Okay.
That's a big number for a family of 4. But with that number, with these two wells would have pumped in 3 minutes what a family of 4 uses in a month.
How often are they running 24/7, those pumps?
Oh, yeah, they run. So
Wow.
Chris Mays' office, the Attorney General's office, looked at these permits and they found inconsistencies with the way they were filled out, and they took it to the Land Department, and the State Land Department agreed with them, and they rescinded these contracts. So the headline here is, as big as this farm was or is, the operation was going to get bigger with more of this water, and the state has put the brakes on that. And Mays told us that this is the first step. They're going to look over the rest of these leases, these contracts, these water applications, and their goal is to maybe not shut this company down, but drastically affect the way they use the water in the ground.
Attention to detail, to the fine print, and then they'll start looking over contracts in all these other rural areas, which is, like you said, if she's putting the brakes on this, it's pretty much an about face from the previous administrations. We've had more than a decade of Arizona leadership that has been very pro-business, pro-growth, right?
Yeah, and we've all benefited from big business
The
coming
revenue.
to Arizona, but there are some areas where some regulators say the state could have been a little more aggressive, and water is one of them. And another headline that came out of this meeting that we had, this interview that's airing tonight, is that we talked in that story about these areas of Arizona where water is regulated. They're called active management areas. The Phoenix area, Maricopa County, Pinal County, Pima County, Santa Cruz County. They still have farming, but they basically count the amount of water that you use. They keep track of it, and there are certain limits. And what I had heard when I had talked to regulators and lawmakers for years is that in order to establish a new active management area under our current law, the residents of an area need to vote for it.
Like voting in an HOA.
Right. And what I found out is that that's not true. The director of the Arizona Department of Water Resources has the authority to create new active management areas. So we've heard all along that the law needed to be changed, and what we found out yesterday is that maybe the law doesn't need to be changed as much, but our state leaders need to exercise the authority they have under the law that they have, and they can then start doing something about at least taking stock of how much water we have under the ground here, how it's being used, and how we need to or may need to ration it, because as we said, we're going to be getting big cuts from the Colorado River. I mean, that's pretty much a foregone conclusion. So we're going to be relying more on our groundwater for cities. Farms are going to have to rely more on groundwater, the farms that we're relying on CAP.
Sure.
So at the very least, we need to know how much water there is and how it's being used, so we can make sure that this natural resource works for us for the foreseeable future, as long as we're going to be here, and we want to be here for a long time.
I know for that, for sure, because, I mean, face it, we're in the Arizona desert. Water is a very precious resource for us, but it is interesting because if the state then has the power to create these, what is the acronym?
Active management areas.
AMAs for these water regulators, because we know right now water regulators, like any other state agency, they're underfunded, undermanned right now, right?
Yeah, and I looked at an audit of the Arizona Department of Water Resources that was done a few years ago, and this audit pointed out some areas where this department should be exercising its authority a little more and doing more, but they were also, the victims of huge budget cuts. So, that department is showing itself to be more critical today than it ever has been because of our drought. But so they have probably a better argument to lawmakers that they need more money. But some of the things that agency should be doing, according to the Attorney General, are things that don't cost a lot of money. Looking at an area and measuring the amount of groundwater that's there, so we have sort of an idea, is not a money-intensive process. Hydrologists know how to do it. It's done all the time. It's just hasn't been done on a large-scale, project by the state of Arizona. So Chris Mays says there are things that the Arizona Department of Water Resources should be doing right now that can prepare us to preserve this resource.
Yeah.
And she wrote 2 letters this week to the director of the Department of Water Resources, pointing out some of these things that her office now believes they should be doing. And we'll see what happens.
Efficiency and streamlining, but also when you take a look at these rural areas, because we mentioned Governor Ducey did recruit so many out-of-state and out-of-country companies to come here to Arizona to build their plants, to build their organizations. And we've talked about agriculture takes up 70% of Arizona's potable water, but it is a $24 billion industry. We've seen a big push for the computer chips and other things like that. Are there other industries that are really tapping deep into that water well?
Mining industry also uses a lot of water, but as you said, at the end of the day, agriculture uses 70% of our water, and we've spoken to all kinds of experts. None of them say that we can proceed without agriculture. It's just that there are going to need to be steps taken by farmers to become more water, conservationist. Just looking at the video, the Fondamonte facility, the Saudi Arabian facility, they use sprinklers. That's not considered one of the more efficient ways to water the ground in an alfalfa field. Just from the agriculture experts who I've spoken to, there are more efficient ways. That might be the least expensive way, or it might be the way they chose to do it. But just steps that farmers are going to have to take could make a big difference in the amount of water they use. That 70% goes to agriculture, and the other 30% goes to residential and cities and businesses. That should be sort of reassuring to people in Arizona, because we often hear that phrase, we just can't have more people here. We're running out of water. It's not the people that are using the water. We have plenty of water. It's just coming up with ways to use it that preserves it. That's the challenge for industry and especially agriculture right now.
That is interesting that you bring that up, because I feel like folks are always going on the people and fighting growth and everything like that. So this is a very important conversation to have. Anything else that you want to add? We don't want to steal the thunder for everything that you're doing, but it is our lead story tonight.
No, this is a really big deal, and I think that this is just the beginning of what we're going to start seeing with these new state lawmakers, the new governor, the new attorney general, and how they deal with water. One of the other big issues that is just starting to sort of come forward is there are Wall Street investors who are buying up tracts of land in Arizona for the water rights.
Oh my gosh.
They're like speculators, and the idea is that they're going to be able to sell that water to cities or to farmers. So that's another thing that the Attorney General's office said they are just starting to take a look at. Is there a downside to this? Is there an unintended consequence? But that's an issue that's just on the horizon that I think is going to become a big, big headline.
But you scratched the surface of it in the story that we played that clip for you earlier with Rio Verde and that community of 800 or so homes north of Scottsdale. But we have seen the federal government in recent years offer billions of dollars to farmers to cut back voluntarily on their Colorado River water usage. So if Arizona can be more responsible stewards of this precious resource, then perhaps other states will take what's happening here and say, let's take a fine-tooth comb and look more closely at those water contracts, and maybe we won't have to take the federal mandated cuts if we can make some concessions.
Yeah, they can police themselves. There are a lot of really good and really, sincere farm owners out there who are doing a very good job of growing important crops and using as little water as possible. But then there are also, the ones that give everybody a bad name, that just pump as much as they can because they'll do it until the well goes dry, and then they'll just pack up and go somewhere else. And those are the ones that the Attorney General, at least, indicates that she wants to take a close look at.
She's red flagging them now and laser focused on making some changes to these farms that are pumping enough water in 3 minutes.
3 minutes for an entire family to
of
use
4
in a month.
of the water use. It kind of blows your mind, but there's more to come. It is our top story tonight at 6 and 6:30 on CBS 5 and 3 TV, Arizona's Family. Morgan Loew, our chief investigator, thank you for that perspective and sharing the story.
Thanks
with
for
us.
having me.
You bet.
Thanks for watching Arizona's Family. Watch us live wherever you are. Our mobile and streaming news app. You can also watch us on Roku, Apple TV, Fire TV, and Android TV. Subscribe on YouTube for live breaking news